It's not just continuity and stability, Jasper. It seems that the markets prefer the right. Do they?
Prefer
the right wing.
Well, I think it's a bit hard to tell. The market's been quite volatile in the last couple of days, so whether they prefer the right or the left is not clear to me.
Right. But, how do you...
There is one aspect of economics that I think are interesting, and it's linked to the election, and that is foreign direct investment. What I'm reading, people who are economists and writers on the subject expect a considerable inflow into the country from overseas. And why? Because of a stable government. Businessmen overseas always like stability and a continuity of policy. And if the BJP comes to power with Prime Minister Modi, you have that. And if those predictions are true, India may have a surge of foreign investment, which is, could make a significant difference, particularly on the issue of employment, because that's a big area where the government has a major weakness. At some point, we may want to discuss that issue, that it has to somehow address more creatively than it's done so far.
Well, conceptually, I agree with Walter, and would certainly agree, with my investor hat on, that continuity matters. Having said all of that, and this will be the one part of the cold realities on the morning of the 24th, the economy is not in great nick at the moment.
It isn't?
It isn't in great nick at the moment. So every indicator that certainly we look at would suggest that the BJP or whoever gets in, frankly, has got their work cut out for the next stage of the cycle. There may be some benefits in that there are plenty of other places in the world, not least China and Russia, that are more scary for investors at the moment. But I wouldn't necessarily directly correlate the continuity of BJP, if they get in, with a huge inflow of FDI.
This has been called a business-friendly party. Do you see these numbers as a vote of confidence from the markets?
From the markets, yes. I think the BJP is seen as more corporate-friendly. It's seen as more pro-economic reform. And with Congress, I think there is still some suspicion that it has a legacy of a statist, quasi-socialist approach. It may not be entirely justified because, of course, it was under a Congress government, Narasimha Rao's government, that economic liberalisation first took hold in the early 1990s. But I think there's also a sense of if Congress did come to power, it would be as part of a probably unwieldy coalition government, which would have a populist and probably confused economic policy and might be changing Prime Minister every, 12, 15, 18 months, which clearly would not be very welcome to the markets. So this is a vote of confidence, both in Narendra Modi and the BJP. I also have to say it's a vote of confidence in the exit polls too.
It is indeed. How do you read the market's reaction?
Yes, Congress is a socialist party. It's a party of the people, and I don't think it is seen as a pro-business and pro-capitalist party. And Mr. Modi is much more friendly towards corporates. But at the same time, I would like to say that on the ground, there hasn't been so much difference in terms of Mr. Modi's reforms, and doing business in India. I know many French companies which still experience, a lot of red tape in India. And Mr. Modi has not been able to break that, the whole of the bureaucracy on doing business in India. So, yes, he's seen as more market-friendly by the stock market, but on the ground, his reforms haven't made a big difference compared to the Congress. Am I right?
And the sheer number of people who've come out to vote, especially women this time.
I think that is really heartening because this has not been the most turbocharged of campaigns. It has been quite low-key. At times it has been slightly dull. It's been very negative. It didn't have the energy of the 2014 election, yet more people have voted and more women have exercised their democratic strength at the ballot box. And that's a tremendous tribute to India's democracy. And there's other democracies I can think of, including my own, where turnout levels are often way short of 67%.
Right, and so if you look at the past, so 2004 was about 58%, 2009 again 58%, and the 66.4 that we saw in 2014 was attributed to the Modi wave. And this was called a waveless election, and yet we have more people coming out to vote.
Well, there wasn't an increase. I mean, the increase between this and the last one is marginal.
But the number of people is higher, so then...
But the number of people is higher, but the percentage is more or less the same. But there wasn't, a surge. It wasn't a surge to 70 or 75%. And, obviously there's high interest in this, I think in part because parties are better organized to bring out the vote than they have been in the past. And they went to a great effort to do so. But there was not a real surge. A surge would have been 70%. 72. Some states had that. West Bengal had up to that level.
But West Bengal has traditionally been a high voter turnout state.
Yeah, and for reasons that people have written about, and the same is true in the Northeast, which is quite a different reason why they turn out in such high numbers of 70, 72, 74%. In the rest of the country, it tends to be a bit lower. But there wasn't, as I say, you have to have a surge from the 66, 67 of the last election to something like 70, 72. That didn't happen. And because I think in this election, it's a new subject that I'm introducing, you didn't really have an emotional issue that geared people up to go to the polls. You did in 2014. You had an emotional issue. This time you really didn't have an issue that was so emotional that it drove millions of additional people who would normally not have voted to vote. But there's one other issue I wanted to add to a point that Andrew had made as to a gap. Historically, the poor have voted in higher numbers than the rich. This is the only major democracy in which that's the case. In every other one, it's just the other way around. And that, in my mind, reflects a trust of the vast majority of the poor in the legitimacy of the system that will help them. Now, that has a constraint on policy. Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why Mr. Modi hasn't done the reforms that you mentioned, he's stuck to a lot of these social welfare programs, which in the 2014 campaign, he said, we're going to get rid of that, we're going to sort of focus on growth. Well, he hasn't.
Loan waivers work in this country.
Yeah, and the reason he hasn't is you have a large number of very poor people who vote, who don't want these various programs to be eliminated, and he hasn't. In fact, if anything, he's increased it. Look at all the things that they're promising now.
But yes, one thing that we don't know very much about is, or at least I'm not very clear about, is the temper of the social media campaign and whether that has contributed to a high turnout. I mean,
but the social media is a bit of an echo chamber. You look at the vast majority of this country, they're not on Twitter, they're not on Facebook, maybe WhatsApp.
Well, I've actually had a phone call from Narendra Modi and a text message from Rahul Gandhi in the past week on my very basic mobile phone. I'm afraid they're both disappointed, but nevertheless, I think a lot of people are members of WhatsApp groups, do access WhatsApp, do take calls. I mean, there've been tens of millions of calls, voice calls, recorded messages put out by the parties, as well as text messages. And I just think that may have increased the salience of the election among people who might not otherwise have voted.
What explains more women coming out?
Well, I think it's partly a cyclical thing. I mean, it's partly about women emerging more broadly across the country. I'm slightly with Andrew in the sense that care of Mr. Ambani, you've got 300 million geo connections across India that have hit the ground in the last couple of years, and that'll be across the genders. And there's been a very, very sophisticated WhatsApp campaign there, so that will affect both men and women. But it's outstanding the number of women joining the fray.
It is indeed.
The number of cell phones that are being sold. India has the highest growth in cell phones in the world.
Yes.
And now you have something like 1 billion cell phones, and women have many of those cell phones. And so they're getting direct...
They're making independent political choices.
Yes, they're making, and that helps them to do that. They're getting direct communication. And I think that has partly driven, people to vote.
But I think, Palki, on the turnout piece, actually you have to disaggregate it. It's like so many things in this election. The absolute aggregated figure of 67%, it doesn't tell one as much as what's happening constituency by constituency. So I recall quite recently there was a low turnout in Maharashtra. I know just amongst my peer group of business people in Delhi that there's been a certain amount of fatigue and cynicism.
Delhi and Mumbai have traditionally not been very participative.
But QED, Palki, in the sense that one has to look at this turnout constituency by constituency to really understand what's going on.
Indeed. There's one more...